Oh,
Cool.
I got it.
Oh, sorry. Is anybody sitting? No. But really? My wife and I join you? Please do. Okay, cool. All right, thank you.
I turned it off. You got it?
Okay, well, thanks. I'm really going to try and be loud instead of talking into this thing, but it sounds like it's picking me up anyway. So, well, we'll see. Hopefully, both will work between the two of them. Well, thanks for being here. And actually, somebody tonight was asking, why, why do I know about this stuff? And so my research is about plants and how plants deal with stresses in the environment, which includes drought. And so it's important to understand what the physical drivers are. I have a graduate minor in meteorology in addition to plant physiology, and so that's where some of these interests come from. So I'm going to talk tonight. I'm going to start off by describing, we all know that California is an incredibly diverse place, and for many of us, it may be why we live here. There's incredible amount of natural and biological diversity, cultural diversity, and so on. So what are the sources of the diversity in California? Well, of course, for the kinds of things we'll talk about tonight, the climate and weather diversity across the large spatial extent of the state. We're a very topographically diverse place, and for trees and forests and grasslands, things like the direction of the slope and the steepness of the slope are important. We are very diverse in soils and microclimates at the scale of organisms. Of course, this leads to all of the things from the top of the list lead to a high diversity of vegetation types. It includes many kinds of charismatic species, not just of plants, of animals. We have the tallest trees and the biggest trees and the oldest trees and the bristlecones, and then some of the coolest trees like the Joshua tree, highly iconic member of the Mojave Desert. Of course, we have tremendous diversity in our human resources and our economic activity. So we're an important place. We all know, we hear things like, well, California, if it was a separate country, it would be like the 7th largest economy in the world and that kind of stuff. So it's important to understand where our weather and climate patterns come from and how they impact everything else on this list. California is also a hotspot of biodiversity. And you can see these patterns in these red colors, the hotspots of biodiversity throughout the U.S. Most of them are montane locations, so these are really sky islands of biodiversity, and there's all kinds of considerations about what happens when things get warmer or drier for the ranges of these hotspots of biodiversity. But notice that in California, we have the lion's share of the national biodiversity hotspot density or concentration. Okay, so it's important to keep all of these things in mind as I proceed tonight. So we'll talk about weather and climate, and sometimes you hear that climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. And really, climate is the long-term average of weather, and the weather are the day-to-day conditions. And we have varying capacity in our ability to predict and envision different kinds of scenarios for weather into the future. We'll talk a little bit about tonight what happened with the drought, and then what were some of the impacts of the drought. So that'll make up roughly 2/3 of what I have to say tonight. And then talk about where we are at right now with El Nino and a couple of prognostications, not my own, so if they're wrong, don't be bugging me in the hall about that. And then we'll wrap up. Okay, so we'll start with a really brief summary of some of the things that create California's unique diversity of climate and weather patterns. So we start with macro-scale global circulation patterns, and all. A couple things to note from this are these sort of cloudy-like circulation patterns shown in a three-dimensional and cutaway view here. And what I wanted to point out are where these two major circulation patterns converge on one another. We get downwelling of air masses, warm, dry air. And notice here, right above where it says subtropical, is where California is. So a lot of our warm, arid conditions derive from this convergence of those two major circulatory cells. Also notice some of these wind patterns here, the northeast trade winds that kind of are looking southwards and towards the west, and we'll get back to that later on when we're talking about El Nino. Very large scale influences on what happens in California. So when you heat up the central portion of the equatorial regions with a lot of water, a lot of evaporation, you set water in motion, it carries a lot of heat, and it has momentum. And the consequence of those three things on a rotating planet is that you get a lot of chaos at the surface. So, at the point where these large air masses converge or diverge from one another, we have highs and lows that, when you set them moving on a rotating, almost spherical planet, you get these ribbons of high-speed winds known as the polar jet and the subtropical jet. And at a slightly smaller scale than the global circulation patterns I showed previously, we get influences on California's climate based on the position of those jet streams. And notice how they're not perfectly circular or annular around the planet. They meander and they change shape, and they help to drive across the surface at the planetary boundary layer these regions of high and low pressure systems. High pressure systems generally associated with clear, sunny weather. Low pressure systems associated with cloudy weather, and the gradients between the highs and the lows result in wind patterns. And notice that along this front here is where there was a bunch of rain that passed through here last weekend. This is an image taken last night showing last weekend's rain now over the Midwest. Now, as we zoom into smaller scales, we have these mesoscale effects that are very important in California. The so-called rain shadow effect, where air masses laden with water off the ocean are forced up and over topographic features. And in so doing, as they rise, they cool and they leave their precipitation on the on the windward side of those mountains. And then this is portrayed down here in a version that looks a lot more like California, where we have coast ranges and things like the Monterey Bay. And so some of the rainfall comes out of these systems here. We have the Central Valley, we have the Sierra Nevada, and then on the leeward side, we have drier air masses. So the air comes in off the ocean, up and over these topographic features. And because the Sierra is taller, a lot of that precipitation falls out as snow, which is good. It's our water towers. That's where our water is stored, and which, when it does fall, melts into our reservoirs. And helps to recharge groundwater down here in the Central Valley, or at least it used to, before it was all diverted. So, the sum consequence of these various factors I just outlined really briefly is that we get very complex patterns of precipitation in the western U.S. by, say, comparison to what we see in the east. In the east, these colors, the green colors mean lots of rain. The bluest colors mean a whole lot of rain. Red means less rain in this cool to warm color schematic. So the eastern half of the U.S. is very driven by moisture flow from the Gulf of Mexico. At the 100th meridian, things turn dry. The 100th meridian is roughly the line, vertical line in this case, that bisects Nebraska. So that's for your Trivial Pursuit later on. And then in the west, we see patterns that are driven by, in many cases, the topographic complexity. So we see the high rates of precipitation in the Pacific Northwest, and we see the rain shadow effect of the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada combined with some of those convergent downwelling systems around 30 degrees north latitude. So these things all kind of result in the diversity of climate patterns, the long-term sort of average of weather, and the more short temporal scale weather patterns that we see. So we see highest rain way up here, lowest rain way down here. Actually, the rainfall down here, on average, is 4% of what they get up here. And you can see all of the other kinds of influences, the Sierra Nevada, the Central Valley, and then the coast ranges. And that all sort of kind of shows up in the bluer colors, and then we see the rain shadow effect, and that 30-degree latitude warming, drying effect here on the eastern deserts. So that's what California looks like in an average year. Okay, where do these different rainfall, snowfall systems come from? Well, in the winter we have cold systems that come from largely the Gulf of Alaska. But we can also have warmer systems that come from the tropics, and depending on how they're entrained into the jet stream, sometimes these are referred to as atmospheric rivers, AR for short. Sometimes you'll hear Fritz Coleman describe these as Pineapple Express. Okay? Some of the other sources of moisture include summertime thunderstorm systems driven by high pressure, this is called Bermuda High, that bring moisture out from the Gulf of California. And then, of course, along the coast here, and important for the redwoods, are the summer fog and the coastal stratus layers that impact the water relations and the water supply for coastal vegetation. So different times of the year, and in fact you can pick up different signatures in the water from these different sources if you are so inclined to do those kinds of things. So here's where the drought monitor is at right now, or a few days ago, on the 10th. And so we see different patterns of different colors, yellow, various shades of orange, and then into the red and the dark red. And so what obviously stands out is that much of California is in some color of yellow, orange, or very dark red. And a whole lot of it is in fact the throes of exceptional drought. Okay. But let's look at what this has looked like in previous years. So here's the year 2000, and things are looking not so bad in California. And in fact, in 2005, we had a pretty good snowfall, rainfall season. And you see that, in fact, almost all of the state is white, or not being impacted by drought. Here's 2010, and then 2011 was our last sort of reasonable rain and snowfall season. And then here we are in 2015. So you can see that over the course of 5 years, which is not so long in a sort of a weather climate kind of spectrum, that things can change pretty rapidly. Okay, and so here's where we were a couple months ago. The state in, 92% of the state in some form of severe to exceptional drought. And 10 years ago, everything was pretty fine. So things can change, at least on a geologic scale or a meteorological scale, pretty quickly. So you can go and look up the U.S. Drought Monitor or the California Drought Monitor, and you can download these kinds of images. And this is for it's over a week ago now, and you see that most of the state is in some degree of drought, and exceptional drought is this darkest color here. And so a large portion of the central part of the state in exceptional drought. This actually is down a little bit because by the time this map was compiled, we'd actually had our first 2 rainfall systems hit the coast of California and part of the interior. So when we look at the trends in drought over the past maybe 15 years or so, we're looking at the area of California on a percent basis. So on the vertical axis is 100% of the state in some kind of drought. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at January 2000 up to, January 2016. So that's just the end of the time scale here. But notice that in almost all of these periods, some portion of the state is in some degree of drought. And so there's really only small amounts of time when there's virtually no drought in the state. So, we're a state that is almost constantly in some form of drought. It's not wet all that often, and so the vegetation, the flora and the fauna have evolved to this over time. But as you can see, various periods of drought, and of course, most recently, quite substantial levels, area of the state, virtually 100% in some degree of drought. So it was dry for 3 years. As I mentioned a few moments ago, our last really good sort of winter season was 2011, and then 2012, 13, 14, 15. We keep hoping that the rain and snow would arrive, and then it didn't. And so we can see that by comparison to other portions of the arid and semi-arid western U.S., California was really hit hard by exceptional drought through much of the state. And so we'll get back to surmising some of this. Now here's another way of looking at this, the Sacramento River Basin. And we're looking at a time scale going back to 1915. You probably can't see the labels. 1915 to 2015. And the reddish yellow colors are periods of time when the conditions were drier, and then the blues are wet. You kind of squint your eyes. You could, if you want, count all the squares, but you can see that there's only a couple of really wet periods here. There's a couple of times when it's a little bluish, but the orange-red colors stand out. So again, we're almost in some kind of drought situation in some part of the state. Now you probably heard that our snowpack was pretty low recently. In fact, it was the lowest it's been in about 500 years, using a number of different sources of data, from reconstructing tree rings or looking at sediments in water bodies, where you can look at layers of muck and the kinds of pollen or other biological signals that are in those layers. Likewise in tree rings and other kinds of these so-called proxy data, where you can reconstruct climate conditions, either precipitation and or rainfall, with lots of clever kinds of analytical methods for doing that. So using that kind of information, we can kind of look backwards in time and go, wow, the Sierra snowpack hasn't been like this for roughly 500 years. And just like some of those other sort of time series diagrams, we can look, these are just recent examples. Here's the Sierra snowpack in January 2013, January 2014, February 2014, so just a month later, and then January 2015. So these are a year apart, and so these are really slim amounts of snow. Okay. So because our snowpack is important for our water resources, a lot of different kinds of efforts are underway to monitor the snow courses, which is sort of the term that's been historically used for places where snow is measured. And some of these data sets go back to the 1920s. I'll show you one of those in a moment. This one goes back to the 1960s. But understanding the snowpack is everything for understanding how you're going to capture water and how you're going to meter it out to agriculture and to municipalities and so on. So there's been several decades of snow analysis that's been conducted. There are snow labs in the Sierra. There are remote sensing stations that monitor snowpack. There, of course, are satellite methods for doing this, and microwaves are really good for monitoring the amount of snow on the ground. What it doesn't tell us yet, what we're still trying to work on, is how much water is in that snowpack. In any case, here we're looking at a few decades of snowpack from the mid-1960s up to this year, and you can see a tremendous amount of variability. And so that's one thing I wanted to point out, is that in California, we think about normal rainfall years or normal snowfall years, normal precipitation years. There is no normal. There's just a lot of variability. There are extremely wet years, many of which in this record here are El Nino years, such as 1982-83 right here, and 1997-98. But we also see some pretty notoriously dry years, like 76-77, and that was one of the until this particular drought, it was the drought of record, the drought of memory for many people. And it's also a time when the state of California undertook a lot of adaptation measures for drought, with drip irrigation and all kinds of other things that we take for granted now. So that was really a few decades ago, and it was sort of phase one in the state's adaptation measures to drought. And we learned a lot and adapted a lot, but of course we've learned a lot since then as well. So, and then there was the late 1980s, and so here we are down over here. So here's 2011, which I said was a pretty good rain and snow year. This scale here, here's 100%, so that's an average year, this blue line, this horizontal blue line, everything above. So 2011 was more than 150% over average, but look where it's been since then, less than 50% for the past 3 years. And then the snowpack, April 1 is the date on which the snowpack crews go out and they stick poles in the snow to measure the snow depth. And on that day this year, it was 5%. And in many places, there was actually no snow on the ground in these long-term monitoring sites. So my plant ecology and physiology research takes place in Mammoth Lakes, where snowfall derives or supplies about 80% of the annual water budget for the vegetation and for the town of Mammoth Lakes. And then much of that snowpack, when it melts, is diverted into the Owens River and then shipped down to the city of Los Angeles, provides about 50% of LA's annual water supply. So they've been measuring snow there, and this goes back to the days of William Mulholland, for those of you who are familiar with the LADWP history. So this is 1928, or the earliest days of the April 1st snowpack measurements. So they measure them every year, April 1st, and you can see this tremendous amount of interannual variability again, like in the last slide. So again, no normal years. The numbers are slightly different because this is just one site compared to the previous slide. The mean at this site is 136 centimeters, so 1.5 meters, around 4 feet of snow. Coefficient of variation is a way of comparing between sites, or the amount of variation over time. And in this location, it's 48%. And by comparison to other sites in the western U.S., this is fairly high. So a high degree of high and low amounts of snow from year to year. And you can see, give a sense of that variation from the 1 and 2 standard deviations portrayed here. So that suggests to us that, you know, things are once in a while they're going to be very wet, and sometimes they're going to be very dry. And here we can see 2015. This is the only year in the record in which they had, on April 1st, 0 snow on the ground. So even in things like during the 76-77 drought, which again is kind of the benchmark for recent decades, you know, they still had just roughly a foot of snow on the ground at this 8,300 foot site just off the Mammoth Mountain ski area. Okay, so of course snowpack results in the water content, and as I mentioned a few moments ago, the water content is not easily derived from just the depth of the snow. It depends on how much moisture is in the air, how light and fluffy the snow is, and what sublimates off the surface during the evolution of the snowpack. But we can see here are various years with over 100%, and then more recently half and less than half, and of course 5%. So, you know, we're due for a nice wet system. It would be lovely. And here you can see select historic years, some of the lowest. So even of the lows, we're still like 1/5 of some of those other notorious lows, like in 1977 and 76. Okay, so we derive a lot of our water from this surface snowmelt that's caught in reservoirs and then diverted to various uses throughout the state. But we also use a lot of groundwater in this state, and we've historically used groundwater, and we're overdrafting groundwater. And so there's been subsidence in certain parts of the state, but we've really been tapping into the groundwater recently. And this is an image that derives from a satellite that, believe it or not, can actually detect variation in the gravitational field associated with the mass of ground. And this satellite's called GRACE, and it was developed by JPL and people at UC Irvine. And so this image shows the change in the gravitational field associated with the loss of water due to groundwater pumping and other sorts of groundwater. And so you can see 2002 and 08 was a little bit wet, but it followed on 2007, which was a fairly dry year. But you can see the progression, the change in the water storage over that 12-year period. So we think a lot about the fact we don't have snowpack, but we also have to keep in mind that when we don't have snowpack, particularly in this drought right now, we've really been tapping into groundwater resources to help subsidize that supply. Okay, so let's summarize here. It's been dry. It was dry for 4 years. And of those 4 years, if you added all the years together and looked at actually what we got for those 4 years, it's as if 1 year didn't rain or snow at all. So we basically lost one of those 4 years. again, looking at historic trends in tree rings and other kinds of what we call proxy sources, that is beyond the instrumented record of the past roughly 100 years, then we've been able to determine, not we, colleagues have been able to determine that this is a 1 in 1,200 year drought. So you look at how long it's been that we've had sub-average precipitation, and you'd have to go back roughly 1,200 years to see another drought of this nature. So when you think about the last ice age maximum, if these occurred with some kind of regularity, we would have had about 18 of these droughts since the last ice age. So multiple, from a biological perspective or ecological perspective, multiple opportunities for the vegetation of California to have experienced these kinds of things before. And indeed, in some places, trees are really suffering, but in other places, they're quite fine. And then using climate models, which incorporate our best knowledge of the physics of the atmosphere and chemistry of the atmosphere and how climate and weather work around California at those larger scales that cascade down into our weather patterns here. And then using these computerized models, which try to capture the best of the physical coupling of the oceans and the atmosphere, we can do a little experiment in which we take the CO2 out of the atmosphere in these climate models, and we find that this drought would have been much less likely to have occurred without the warming influence of the CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So it suggests, it's some tantalizing evidence that perhaps this drought was subsidized in some part by anthropogenic greenhouse gas buildup over the past 150 or so years. Okay. So as of a couple of days ago, roughly 37 million people are impacted in California by the drought. So what happened anyway? So what went wrong? Why didn't we get the rain and the snow? So we talked about the jet streams, one of those earlier slides. So a pattern of the jet stream flow that is zonal flow in this manner, that is roughly from west to east, without a lot of curves and dips and all those kinds of things, is the kind of flow pattern for the jet streams that brings a lot of moisture to California. If that thing diverges to the north, then it takes the moisture away from us. And that, in essence, is what happened. And this happened because of this persistent high-pressure ridge. So now we're kind of looking down on the Earth in this image. So let me orient you. Here's North America. And you see these orange colors indicating higher than normal air pressure. And the blue colors and the purple colors indicate regions of lower air pressure. And this system kind of set up, and this was known by some as the ridiculously resilient ridge. So a ridge of high pressure that got embedded there over the ocean, the northern Pacific, and just didn't budge. And in certain years, these things might sit there for a while and then shake loose and then move with the jet streams across the planet. But this one didn't do that. And that's part of the culprit of what happened with our rainfall. So this also led to anomalously high sea surface temperatures. And in some circles, this was known as the blob of warm water off the coast of western North America that was probably feedbacks between the warm ocean temperatures in this slide and the high persistent high pressure ridge here, because there's a lot of coupling of the ocean surface with the atmosphere, and they feed back on one another. So the persistence of the blob here played into the whole story about what happened to our rain and snow. And this is basically what happened. With that persistent high ridge sitting out there to the west of Seattle, it was causing that zonal flow to no longer be zonal. It's now azonal, or sometimes referred to as meridional. That is, instead of acting like a nice annulus around the planet, there was this divergent pathway up to the north to Alaska, British Columbia, and then curving back down. Not quite over the Rockies like that, but, and again, the warm water off the coast was contributing to this. And so we would see patterns like this. We would see flows of moisture that were basically riding the pathway of the jet stream. And you can pretty much tell where the jet stream is because it underlies this pathway here. And so you can see that the systems are driving way to the north. The ridiculously high ridge is right here. The warm water's right there. So that water, instead of moving sideways laterally in an annular or zonal flow, is azonal up to the north, way over here, and over Boston, dumping a bunch of moisture there. Okay, so you can kind of see, here's we're looking down on the system. Here is more of an oblique angle, but the storm track going up to the north and around that ridiculously resilient ridge. Okay, so that ridge stayed there. It formed each year, and so we'll see to what extent that complicates things, because the water is still warm out there in the Pacific. It has cooled down a lot, and more than one person tonight has told me that when surfing or diving or doing something recently, they've noticed that after the first couple of rainfalls, starting at the end of October, beginning of November, November 2nd, that the water temperatures have cooled down considerably. That may be a good sign. Okay, so we've got this drought, and let's think about some of the impacts on ecological patterns and processes, and actually more, as we'll see, more than just ecological outcomes. The PDSI is the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and it's a way of capturing a couple of different aspects associated with soil moisture that's available for plants. And so this was derived from an agricultural context. And the PDSI allows us to kind of compare different parts of the world over different periods of time. So if I direct your attention to this upper graph, we've got since the 1900s looking at the PDSI, and wetter periods are shown in blue and drier periods in red, and you can see this trend over the past 100 years of increasing regions of PDSI that are associated with drought over that 100-year interval. So with drought, drought and soil water availability is one of the fundamental things that determines how happy plants and forests and grasslands will be. If there's enough water, then they'll be able to do photosynthesis, they'll be able to make new leaves and roots and flowers and seeds and so on. If those conditions are no longer suitable, then the vegetation is going to be compelled by one means or another to either move with its preferred conditions, or if it can't move, it is going to have to evolve in order to be able to tolerate those conditions, or perhaps invoke new physiological mechanisms to tolerate those conditions, or perhaps go extinct at that location. So we may see whole-scale changes in species distributions associated with warming temperatures and drier conditions. And the thing about warming temperatures and drier conditions is that they go kind of hand in hand. If we just had a lack of water but the temperature stayed the same, then the plants might be able to get by okay. But warming temperatures in concert with drying conditions, they exacerbate the situation, and they interact, and they cause what's called climatic water deficit, making the drought even that much more problematic, because the warm temperatures enhance the amount of evaporation from soil surfaces, from from reservoirs, from leaf surfaces. So it makes things that much more complicated. So soil water, we're moving into smaller scales now, are going to help determine how much photosynthesis that plants can do. So the green arrows here indicate carbon going into the tree, and some of that carbon is going to go into soils. And from a carbon perspective and anthropogenic climate change, putting carbon into soils is one way of mitigating anthropogenic carbon emissions. It is by no means a way to plant our way out of this. I want to make that clear. At the same time, while plants are absorbing carbon dioxide, they're also giving carbon dioxide off, because they do the same biochemical pathways of respiration that we do when we're breathing out CO2. And so really forests and grasslands and everything else are really going to be taking up carbon and giving off carbon, and the net balance between those two is going to determine whether the vegetation is building up or storing more carbon in soils. If there's not enough water, they can't drive the green arrows, then this balance is going to shift towards the red arrows, and these systems, instead of absorbing carbon, may start to give carbon back off. And some of the research that we do in my lab kind of asks about that question. We have a new project about drought right now that is in which we're trying to determine at what point do we get the tipping point between enough water to make the green arrows operate and be bigger than the red arrows. Where does that flip flop? Okay. So, throughout California, we're seeing widespread patterns of forest mortality, and this is particularly evident in the southern Sierra and in some of the transverse ranges in the San Gabriel Mountains, the San Bernardino Mountains, down around the Grapevine, Tehachapi, and so on. And when you get trees that are stressed by drought, they no longer are able to open up the teeny tiny pores on their leaves that allow them to take up CO2 to make sugars to feed themselves. So they kind of go into a starvation mode. And when that happens, one of the other things that happens is that they can no longer protect themselves from pathogens like beetles, for example. And so there's a lot of places where plants or trees that are affected by drought are no longer able to protect themselves from beetle infestations. Often the beetles carry pathogenic fungi along with them. These all kind of make things worse, and then we end up with these large-scale patterns of forest morbidity and mortality. And in fact, just as an aside, this is going on globally, not just in California. There's large-scale loss of forest cover and productivity, including in some key places like the Amazon rainforest. But these 4 photos here are taken from different forests around the world, showing lots of effects of drought, increasing temperatures, insect pests, and pathogens. And so when these trees stop taking up carbon dioxide, or they take up less carbon dioxide, then you might imagine a lot of sort of consequences that go along with that. This feeds back to elevated CO2 because these trees are giving off CO2, and that CO2 is going to contribute to more climate warming, and so that becomes a positive feedback, net negative consequences. Here in California, during our drought, and coupled with the changes in temperatures, here's that climatic water deficit, emergent property of both the loss of the precipitation, or the reduction in precipitation, and in warm temperatures combining in a 1-2 punch for the climatic water deficit regimes. And so you can see the central and northern Sierra, the transverse ranges hit hard. And the reduction in trees that go along with that. Look at this pattern here south of Tahoe. A large amount of tree loss here, again down in various ranges between the Central Valley, the Los Padres National Forest, San Gabriel, San Bernardino ranges, and down around Temecula and so on. So what does this mean for the carbon that's stored in California? So here in the green we see where lots of carbon is stored in the vegetation, and more importantly in the soils. It'd be nice if this was a soils map as well. But we see lots of carbon here in the Santa Cruz Mountains as well. And what about the changes in that 10-year period leading up to this image? So places in this image that are kind of green are places where carbon is increased. Places where it's brown on this map is where there's been large-scale losses in forest carbon from the trees and from the soils together, in part because of the drought and in part because of the consequent loss of forest cover. And again, we see Los Padres National Forest and those forests in Southern California and parts of the Sierra as well. Okay, so whenever you have trees that are stressed, they're dried out, maybe they're dead, and what are you going to think is going to be one of the next things that's going to happen is that they're going to burn. And so this was the wildland fire outlook, and notice not just in California, but in states like Washington and Oregon and Idaho. And there was a lot of fires, as you may recall, this past late summer. Tremendous impacts on air quality throughout the country, in fact. And in California, we had a number of severe fires, particularly up around Napa, where there was 2 or 3 fires that that impacted the region one after another. Despite the number of fires you see on this image from a couple months ago, I think that in many ways we're breathing a collective sigh of relief because we dodged a bit of a bullet as far as fire goes, wildland fire, compared to just how stressed the state's vegetation happened to be. Could have been a lot worse. Reservoir storage depends where you look, but they're on the order of 33%, 5%, 10%. And I'm sure if you've driven to places and past Oroville or Folsom Lake or Don Pedro or any of those places going to Yosemite, these things are, Don Pedro has got to be 150 feet below what I'm used to seeing in that reservoir a few years ago. So massive reductions in reservoir storage. Okay, and then for my friend Stacy Philpott, loss of agricultural productivity. We feed the nation, and look at some of these numbers: 99% of all almonds and walnuts, 98% of pistachios, broccoli, strawberries, grapes, tomatoes. All of the 90% of the U.S. production is done here in California in certain counties. And then you can see some of the economic impacts of the drought for the past few years. Actually, I think these numbers might just be for 2015. So several hundred thousands of acres that are no longer, or at least temporarily, out of production. A tremendous amount of crop losses. Dairy and livestock. Wisconsin claims to be the dairy state, but we actually outproduce them. And then just the cost of the groundwater pumping that has been utilized to try and make up for the surface water losses. Been tremendous. So here are the 2015 economic impacts. The groundwater pumping that's making up for the loss of surface water, crops, livestock, dairy, and so statewide economic $2.7 billion. And just in 2015, over 18,000 agricultural sector job losses, and those came on multiple years of agricultural losses in the employment sector. Okay, so how are we doing on time here? Okay, doing pretty well. So the second half of the title today is "Will El Nino Save Us?" So let's shift our attention to that now. So, is the great drought of 2012 to 2015 behind us? Will El Nino save us? So El Nino is part of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. This is large-scale oscillatory behavior in the atmosphere driven by patterns in the atmosphere and the ocean along the tropical Pacific. So we got two images here. The upper image would be the so-called normal conditions. Back earlier when I had the big three-dimensional slide of the globe, I pointed your attention to those arrows that were kind of going to the south and to the west. And those northeasterly wind patterns typically drive the pattern of airflow and water temperature in the Pacific Ocean we see in the upper diagram. So this would be under what we call enso-neutral or normal conditions in the tropical Pacific. We have those trade winds that blow from east to west, and they keep a pool of warm water over here near Australia and the Indonesian archipelago of the Western Pacific. Now and so let me just orient you here. Here's Mexico, Central America, South America, and so this is a three-dimensional cutaway view. We see that there's upwelling of cold water off the coast of South America, and this is important for the anchovy and other fisheries of the region and the birds that feed on there, and it's all part of a complex food web. When the conditions change and this upwelling no longer occurs, such as in the lower diagram, which we're not quite at yet, then the fish stocks collapse, the birds are no longer feeding on them. Over 100 years ago, the fishers from Peru noticed this pattern. It was happening around Christmas, so they named it El Nino after the Christ child. So that's the origin of the name. Now, for reasons we do not perfectly understand, every once in a while those northeasterly trade winds stop blowing in their normal pattern in the upper diagram. So things kind of start to reverse. Now we start to see waves of warm water that move across the Pacific around the tropics. These are called Kelvin waves. And you'll get a wave of warm, here's one blob of warm water here along the tropical Pacific, associated with one of these Kelvin waves. Here's another blob of warm water. If this one started moving to the right towards the east, that would be a Kelvin wave. And notice the thermocline and the upwelling here in the normal conditions have reversed. The water here is traveling westward. Now it's traveling eastward, so those Kelvin waves of warm water follow this pattern of the arrows. And so everything's kind of topsy-turvy. And the large-scale circulation of air and warm moist air emanating from the tropics that has momentum, that sets up those large-scale circulatory patterns, gets disrupted. And so it moves partially towards the coast of South America. And so we see the sea surface temperatures warming up in El Nino years. Over here I've got El Nino, neutral, and La Nina. And so this is an oscillation because this behavior goes basically back and forth between El Nino and La Nina conditions, although we often have many years that are neutral, which are sort of normal or in between the two extremes. Here in California, when we've had El Nino years, they're often, not always, wet. And sort of the opposite, if you will, are the La Nina years, which are typically drier than normal. El Nino interacts with a lot of other things, a lot of other oscillatory modes in the ocean atmosphere system. Probably won't talk too much about them, but you may have heard of things like the PDO, or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's another kind of oscillation, kind of like ENSO. Doesn't have the same kinds of global impacts and consequences, but does have large-scale influences and also kind of affects the impact, the global impact of El Ninos. So the kinds of things that we see here in California are referred to as teleconnections. These are downstream impacts of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the warm surface waters near the equator. So in the 1990s, a system of fixed-point buoys and satellites were put in place to measure sea surface temperatures. So here's a kind of an ENSO neutral or typical year. The red colors are warm water, the blue colors are cold water. So here's a blue upwelling, so that would be a happy anchovy fishery. And these are sort of typical conditions. Warm water over here near Australia, Southeast Asia, the archipelago. And then as conditions in the northeasterly trade winds stop blowing and we start to see this blob of warm water move in a series of Kelvin waves eastward across the Pacific. And if you take 97 minus 96, you get this anomaly, or the difference between an El Nino, a brewing El Nino year and a normal year. And so the lower panel is this one minus this one. And you see that temperature difference from one year to the next, by about maybe 3 to 4 degrees warmer in this case. That was December 97, January, February, March 98 was the last pretty substantial El Nino here in California. So that's what that looked like. So I'm not sure how well this diagram shows up where you're sitting near the back, but let me try and orient you somewhat. Here's Mexico and Central America and South America. Over here is Australia and the Indonesian archipelago. So the map, and here's the equator. And so now you see the yellow and red boxes, or rectangles here. These are different regions of the ocean that have been divided up, and they're called Nino 1, 2, 3, or whatever. So Nino 4, Nino 4 over here, Nino 3.4 here. Nino 3 is the red block, and then Nino 1 and Nino 2 are over here. And so temperatures in these different rectangles get put into an algorithm that help to derive various kinds of indices that tell us if we're moving towards an El Nino or a La Nina for that matter. But just looking at the temperatures, So these graphs show the temperatures. So the top one is out here, sea surface temperatures out here, sea surface temperatures in this thick block here, the overlapping 3 and 4 region. Nino 3 right here, Nino 1 and 2 over here. And the 0 line means that the temperatures are average. So everything shown here in orange, going back to December of 2014 at the far left, shows that the waters were warm. They've been warming up. And so if you look at 3.4, and this is the real diagnostic, it's been warming up all year. And last year, as an aside, we started thinking that there was going to be an El Nino. Things started to warm up, and then all of a sudden, everything reversed and it cooled back down again. No why. However, this year it started to crank up again, and now, if you look over here in the summaries, Nino 3.4 is 3 degrees warmer than average, and these are data from 3 days ago, I think. So these are kind of somewhat hot off the presses, and this is a lot warmer than it has been pretty much since the 97, 98, 82, 83 El Nino. So nobody has actually officially come out and said that this is the strongest on record, but it's in the top 3. And in a week or two, you may hear in the news that it's now the strongest one. From a map perspective, we can see here are the anomalies, that is, how much warmer they are than average. And so we can see the darker the red colors, the warmer it is. Right here, the darkest colors are 3 degrees warmer than average for the tropical Pacific. And you can see some of that blob up to the north as well, so really warm waters. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that warmer waters off the coast really impacts. It might steer rainfall systems away from us. It might make them wetter and stronger because you're pumping moisture and energy into the atmosphere as the storm goes by, picks that up and can make things storm stronger. It could also mean that our snow line is higher in the mountains because that water is warmer, and we may have less snow in the Sierra. So this blob of warm water that's sitting out there is going to be sort of the interesting aspect of how this all plays out over the next couple months. Okay, so where are we now? So here are a number of different years, and this is the temperature anomaly of that 3.4 rectangle. That was the one in the bold colors, and that's the one that's often used as kind of the diagnostic. So here are several years. Here's January through December, and then the January of the next year. And so the temperatures go up, and then they drop off. Right here in the blue line, if you can see that, is the 1997 El Nino, and temperatures during that event. And then here's where we are now in the thick black line. Up to, this was this last summer. We are probably up here now and exceeding that blue line, but we're following basically the same trajectory as the last El Nino that provided substantial rainfall here. Now, again, we can use these climate models that exist around the world. Here's a bunch of different climate models. I'd be happy to talk to you about them afterwards. Basically, each color is a different model. They're generated differently. The engine under the hood of these models looks different, but they all run down the highway the same way. But because they are equipped differently, they give off different details in how the Nino 3.4 sea surface temperatures will play out. So the black line is our data, and then the colored lines are what the models had envisioned a few months ago. So we're on track for an El Nino, at least when this was released a couple months ago, that was going to be a degree and a half above average. And of course, we're now doubled that. So we seem to be beating the models at this point in time. So what could be the consequences of this? A recent model run comparing, utilizing all of this information suggests that the storm track will travel to the south this year. And this is good news for skiers, snowboarders, water managers, farmers, growers, and so on. So the blob seems to be disappearing. These are actually geopotential heights. That's not sea surface temperature, that's atmospheric pressure above the ocean. However, if this was looking like the previous few years, this would be red. And the blob and the high pressure would be red there, but now this model outlook suggests that the blob is gone, or will be gone, and that the atmospheric pressures will go down. Again, that's a good sign that may allow for the zonal flow. Okay, heavy rains will begin in January. Again, this is underlined according to NOAA's CFS model, not according to Michael White. Okay, I didn't run this model, so if it doesn't rain, I'll remind you that it was according to NOAA's model. Anyways, the green color is suggesting that it will be wet here starting in January. Typically, we haven't had tons of rain so far, and we've had 3 storms, magically a week apart. And we don't really, based on previous experience, we don't really expect the kind of El Nino rainfall to ramp up until January. January to March is typically when we see the major effects. For example, in 1982, the San Lorenzo Valley was especially hard hit. There was about 13 deaths in the Love Creek slide during that El Nino. There was flooding in Santa Cruz. One of the bridges over the San Lorenzo River was taken out, and there was substantial damage in Aptos and landslides, and so some of the local impacts, but these kinds of impacts throughout the state. Now, I'm very interested in the sort of cyclic behavior of rain and snowfall and drought on vegetation growth and wildland fire. So as you might expect, when you get El Nino and a lot of rain, a lot of snow, it's a lot of water to build up a lot of fuel. Then when the drought comes, and the drought's always going to come, and we've seen several slides that show that, then that fuel will dry down and it will become, it will be ready to burn. That's complicated by patterns of management in the past. We have topography that's highly prone to landslides and road closures. And there are significant tourism impacts that are consequences of these heavy rainfall years. So, that's a little taste of where we're at now. Is the Great Drought over? It's still too early to tell. Will El Nino save us? Well, it is yet still too early to tell. Sorry. Ask for your money back on the way out. However, you could stay tuned because I'm going to give this talk again in March at the Santa Cruz Public Library. You can come back in March, and I will tell you what happened. You will probably know by then, but I'll be able to give you a sort of a bit of a more analytical sense of what the outlook looks like for things like the Sierra Nevada snowpack and our water resources. So at this point, I'll say thanks for listening, and I'll be more than happy to take any questions. Thanks. Yes, you down in the front.
Even with above average rainfall, I think that even after this year, there's rain
Okay, so the question from this person I don't even know over here is if it rains and snows like crazy here, like all these prognostications suggest, will the drought be over? And the answer is probably no. We'll need many years like that, maybe 5 or 6 really heavy years to get us back to where we were. And so I'm not sure we can really even count on that. I think what would be ideal is if we could fill the reservoirs and then start to get infiltration and groundwater replenished one way or another. Well, the groundwater just takes way too long to fill up, and so that may be a dip in the bank account that we're never going to replenish. But certainly the reservoirs, and we can start with filling those. But the shorter answer to your question is it'll take a few really good years. Yes?
How vulnerable are the coastal redwoods in Monterey Bay?
Okay, so the question over here is, how vulnerable are the coastal redwoods in Monterey Bay to these kinds of things, to climate change in general? They're probably most vulnerable to changes in fog patterns. I know a few people in the audience who are studying fog. And there's a group up at Berkeley that have been studying this, and the redwoods probably would not be here without the summertime fog, which subsidizes their moisture needs at that time of year when it doesn't rain here. At the very southern extent of their distribution, which happens to be down around Carmel, Big Sur, that area, there's there are efforts afoot to document whether they're actually shrinking, their range is shrinking there. But they're very long-lived trees. They're quite resilient in general to most things like insects and fire, and they've been around here a while. And so, like I said, if this is a 1 in 1,200 year drought, they've probably seen 18 or 15 or 10 of those droughts since the last ice age. And they are able to hang on. They can reproduce asexually by the sprouting at the base. And these are all traits that suggest that they can be fairly resilient to these kinds of disturbances. We're throwing a lot at them, though, at once, so it's a good question. Yes?
Do you think that the San Lorenzo Valley will be affected negatively by the El Nino due to its mountainous landscape?
Okay, the question is, will the San Lorenzo Valley be likely to be impacted by these kinds of El Nino conditions? And the short answer is yes. I live in the San Lorenzo Valley, and when it rains up there, the impacts are usually pretty quick and pretty rapid, and most of the residents are fairly used to some of the disruptions. But it is, as you pointed out, it's a very narrow valley, and that means the water runs off rapidly. And for the residents there, as you know, there's only a few ways in and out, and I think we learned a lot of lessons in the 1980s. The San Lorenzo Valley Water District, for example, and Caltrans and various other agencies, the county of Santa Cruz County. Hopefully, with a lot of advance warning that we're able to generate, then preparedness can be that much better. John?
Yeah, thank you. I read a month or two ago in the LA Times, there were a number of California officials, government officials, scientists saying, beware, this may actually not come. Everybody should not stop conserving waters. And that was one point. But the other point I wanted to ask you about is they raised that if the El Nino comes, it may only hit sort of the southern part of the state, which isn't going to do much to replenish the actual water supply with the snow and the Sierra. And that was a month or two ago. Is there any update indication from the modeling where it might hit, and also what conditions would it take for it to hit the whole state?
So there's a couple questions. Your first point about not relying on this El Nino is actually a really good point, and I've actually been saying that all along as well, is that all El Ninos are not created equally in terms of the amount of precipitation we get in California. Some of them sort of give us a glancing blow, and parts of the state, as you noted, do get wetter than other parts. The 82, 83, the 97, 98, they were good statewide systems. But it is true that where we're at here in Central California, we are really on the cusp, and so there have been El Nino years where we've not seen much of an impact here. And so I agree with that outlook of not stopping our water conservation efforts just because of what some of these signs tell us. And I can't remember the other part to your question.
It was saying it might only hit the southern part of the state. And is there any modeling that would indicate whether that's true? Like, that was 2 months ago. Is that any update?
No. So the short answer is no updates. But it's there is some. No, I'm just going to leave it at that, because that's the easiest way without getting into a lot of detailed analysis, some of which I don't frankly trust. Not disparaging anyone in particular, but just climate models are, they're scenarios of what might happen, and once you start to put probabilities on them, then you start to get into trouble about making projections or predictions. back.
So you were drawing a connection between the strong ridge and the blob of warm water.
Yeah.
What is stopping the warm water from picking up like tropical types of weather? Like on the equator, storms thrive off of warm water. Why doesn't the warm blob thrive off of warm water?
Oh well, it may in fact, and it may feed into synoptic storm systems that are traveling across the ocean. May in fact pick up some of the heat and water off of that blob and
But it
power
hasn't
those
the last few years.
Right, because it has caused the jet stream to veer to the north, but at a certain point that blob is going to lose some strength, and it will not force those systems to the north like that. But there will still be some temperature in there, and so if some of the higher, warmer temperature, the energy. So as that energy dissipates because it's traveling up into the atmosphere, then there's feedbacks between the ocean and the atmosphere in which that will temper the strength of the water energy content. So there will probably be some other drivers that play into that, such as ocean currents and upwelling. And I think that the understanding of what allowed that blob to form in the first place is not, our understanding is not very good. Why it formed, what allowed it to persist, and why it might disappear. And there was a considerable amount of heat energy stored in the ocean over the past couple decades. You may have heard of the climate deniers talking about the global warming hiatus. When you look at some of the graphs and temperatures going up and up, there was a bit of a hiatus that the temperatures didn't increase, kind of stabilized for a few years. And it's thought that one possibility is that a lot of that heat that should have been in the atmosphere continuing the upward trend probably went into the ocean and led to the warming of the blob and perhaps other places. So it highlights the fact we don't understand, the temperature in the atmosphere and how it interacts with the warming of the ocean surface, and then when that comes back out, and all of these things. Incidentally, that upward temperature trend has begun again over the past couple of years, and so there was a hiatus, and we do see other times of hiatus in that long-term temperature increase. I'm not sure that answers fully your question, but it's a good question. Why didn't it pump water? And it may have been the source of the water that ultimately ended up further downstream in other parts of North America last winter.
Yeah, perhaps.
Question?
How will the marine life be affected by the El Nino, and what negative problems will it cause on the ocean?
Sorry, how is the marine life affected? Well, with the warming that we've seen up until recently, we've seen a lot of warm water species from southern latitudes being caught by fishermen off the coast of California, and not just commercial fishermen, but also sort of sport and hobby fishermen. And so we see that some species have expanded their ranges, and perhaps temporarily, maybe just for the period of the warm blob of water out there. And as those temperatures go down, it may be that they start to move back south again. And we're probably going to see some rapid responses in terms of populations of some kinds of organisms, and slow responses of certain kinds of organisms as well, in terms of the numbers of individuals going up and down as the water warms and cools over the past few years and into the next few years. One other consequence of the warming means that certain populations of single-celled or multicellular photosynthetic organisms, diatoms, cyanobacteria, and so on, some of them, when they reach critical population sizes, start to produce toxins like domoic acid and the kinds of things that cause red tides. And there's definitely been an uptick in the domoic acid production off the coast over the past few months. So that's one example of how the warmer water and those conditions can cascade into ecological effects on marine life. Question?
What can the state and county governments do to help?
Well, I think that in the short term, some of the things that can be done, that have been done, are to ensure that that waterways and other kinds of infrastructure are prepared for watercourses, drainage, infrastructure are prepared for high flows of water. That people can be prepared, that sandbags are in place, and I know many institutions, agencies, groups, churches even here in Santa Cruz have sort of stockpiled their sandbags and other forms of preparedness. So there's lots of different ways. I've seen right here, there's lots of attention in the press. There was I think there was like a one-day preparedness workshop this past weekend here in town. So there's lots of different things that can be done by various public, private agencies.
And if the drought isn't broken?
If the drought isn't broken, yeah, boy. Oh, it's that's the rabbit hole we don't want to actually look down. It won't be pretty, and there's lots of potential pathways that we could follow. There's the D word that is being used in some parts of California, desalination. And there's transporting water, but it's heavy and it's expensive. So, frankly, I've been amazed at the adaptation measures that the state did kick in. And you start getting online and look at the kinds of responses that were put in place over the last 4 years. It's cost a lot of money, but a lot of things were rapidly put in place at various levels. And I think the fact that certainly there have been some devastating wildland fires in the state, but in other places, I think as one example of being able to adapt and mitigate for the drought, California's done quite a good job, at least in some aspects. Yes? Okay, so the question was, if we get the kinds of rainfall patterns that that have been suggested, how will that affect sewage releases and things like that? And the coastlines are going to take the brunt of that, and so monitoring is going to be really important. Early warning systems will be really important. Getting the word out that stay away, as the case may be, and then of course follow up, clean up, and those kinds of things. And so the best way is to be prepared. And so there's going to be a lot of ways that we could be impacted if those rains come along.
So you talked about the storm thinking being pushed south. Has there been discussion about the impact on Mexico or Baja?
Interesting question. The question was if storm track is pushed south, and has there been discussions about impacts on Mexico? I have not seen ENSO-related impact scenarios. Of course, there have been tremendous hurricane activity off the coast of Mexico, and that is one impact. For years we were not aware of what a fertile hurricane breeding ground the west coast of Mexico was until GOES-10, the geostationary observing satellite number 10, was put up over the eastern Pacific. And then all of a sudden we started saying, wow, look at all the hurricanes. This year we've seen the warmer waters and much more powerful hurricanes. Typically they go kind of northwest and they die out over the cold waters on the way to Hawaii. But a lot of them have hooked to the north and to the east and drenched Southern California. And of course